So this movie is on the Pivot Table Options tab. We're going to begin in the Pivot Table group where we have access to the Pivot Table Options dialog box. It has 6 tabs on it that gives us a lot of control over what happens in our pivot table. And then we're going to go to the Active Field group where we can rename the field and use the expand and collapse buttons. And then we're going to go to the Group command group where we can create groups out of items either on the columns or the rows. And then to the Data group where we can point the pivot table to a different data source. And then the Actions group where we can clear the pivot table or filters, select the pivot table, or move the pivot table. The Calculations group enables us to add calculated fields or calculated items. Those are 2 different things. The Tools group allows us to create a pivot chart, and the Show group toggles on and off the display of the field list, the expand and collapse buttons, and the field headers. So I've got my data again, and I added a cost field this time to the data. And we're going to use it to, of course, create a pivot table by going to the Insert tab, Tables group, insert into the existing worksheet in cell K6. The first thing we can do in the Options tab in the Pivot Table group is to change the name of the pivot table. And enter. And in the Options drop-down, the first choice is to go to the Options dialog box, which we're going to do in a second. The other 2 choices we've actually covered in other movies. So we're going to go directly to the Options dialog box, and we're going to cover a couple of these options at the same time. We're going to merge and center the cells with labels, and we're going to display the fields in the Report Filter area going over and then down. And we're going to do that using 2 different rows. I'm going to left-click OK. And with that in place, we're going to drop some fields into the drop zone. I'm going to scroll up a little bit so we can see what's happening. Since we chose to have our report filter fields showing going across and then down in 2 different rows, that's exactly what we got. We've got salesperson, then product line over to the right of salesperson. Moving down to the next row, we got gross price, and then to the right, the discount. And then moving one of those fields down to the row labels, we also wanted the row label to be merged and centered, and in fact it is. So going back to the Options dialog box, clearing that checkbox, reorienting the report filter fields to the default setting, left-clicking OK, we get the report filter fields displayed going down in one column, and the row labels field is not merged and centered any longer. Back to the Options dialog box, we have 4 formatting options. We can choose how we want errors to display on the pivot table, choose how we want empty cells to show, and the other 2 options you might find the need to want to adjust from time to time. The first one is Auto Fit Column Widths on Update, and the second one is Preserve Cell Formatting on Update. I'm going to leave those boxes checked, and I'm going to insert some formatting into one of these fields, and then left-click off of it. So with those 2 boxes checked, when I refresh the pivot table, we should still have the yellow fill in the cell that says Jimmy, and the columns should resize according to the content that's in the column. And when I refresh, that's exactly what happens. But if you have content around your pivot table that's oriented to display like you want it to be displayed, and some of that display involves setting a column width, you may not want the column width to auto size when you update the pivot table. And you also may not want to have the cell formatting preserved on update either. So on to the next tab in the Pivot Table Options dialog box. We have a couple of options for grand totals, which are the same that you can find on the Design tab. I'm going to cancel that and go to the Design tab, where we have, like I said, the same options here. Going back to the Options dialog box, we have the option to allow multiple filters per field, and that doesn't mean the ability to select multiple items within a field. Like if you have all the months of the year, you can select January, February, and March to just present the first quarter. What that means is it allows you to establish label filters and value filters on the same field. I'm going to cancel that, and we're going to go back to the options dialog box again. And finally, with sorting, you have the option to use custom lists when you're sorting. And we covered custom lists in another movie, so we're going to move on to the Display tab. The Expand and Collapse buttons are displayed by default when you have subgroups in either your column labels or row labels. We can left-click one of these Expand Collapse buttons, and on the Options tab, we can choose to have them not display at all. Going back to the Options tab again, we can show the contextual tooltips, leaving that on. When I hover over the pivot table, I get some information about that data point. Going back to the Options tab, clearing that checkbox, I now do not get that information when I hover over a cell. Back to the Options tab again. I'm going to turn that back on. Display field captions and filter drop-downs. When I clear that checkbox and go back to the pivot table, you're going to see the row labels and the filter drop-down disappear. Back to the Options dialog box. We can also completely change the way the pivot table looks by checking this checkbox to show the classic pivot table layout. This enables dragging of fields into the grid. I'm going to left-click OK. And there you have the classic pivot table layout. And as the description suggests, you can drag fields right into the grid. Going back to the Options dialog box again, clearing that. We also have some field list options where we can sort the data from A to Z alphanumerically, or we can have it sorted in the way it's presented in the data source. Going to the next tab, we have some printing options. We can print the Expand Collapse buttons when displayed on the pivot table, because as we just found out, we can turn that display off. We can repeat the row labels on each printed page, and we can set print titles, which is the column labels, to be printed on each page. The Data tab enables you to save the source data with a file, which is the cache file. The second checkbox is checked, enables Show Details. What that is when you double-click an item in the pivot table, these are the details. So when we have that option turned off and you double-click, nothing happens other than getting an error message that says you cannot change this part of a pivot table report. I'm going to tell Excel everything's okay. I'm not trying to change it. I'm going to recheck that checkbox. We also have the option to refresh the data when we open the file. That would probably be a good thing to do if our data is from an external connection. And finally, the Alternative Text tab allows us to provide a title and a description for the pivot table for people that have disabilities that access our workbook. So I'm going to cancel out of that. The next group of commands, the Active Field command, enables us to first rename the field that we've selected. We have access to the Field Settings dialog box, where again at the top we can change the name. The other functionality in here we've seen before, so I'm going to cancel out of that. And since I turned off the Expand Collapse buttons in the options, I got to go back and turn them back on so that I can use the command buttons in the Active Field group that allows me to expand and collapse the fields. And of course we can independently do that as well. Group is the next command group, and I'm going to change the pivot table a little bit before we go there and put the product line and the column labels. Because what grouping enables you to do, and I'm going to select one of the column headers, press the Control key down and hold it down, select 1 and 2, product line 1 and 2, and left-click Group. A group is created that combines the presentation of product lines 1 and 2. I can go in and then change the description, and I can also do the same thing pressing the Control key with row labels, selecting the group that I created for the column labels. I can ungroup, and for the row labels, the same thing. The next command buttons we've already gone through in other movies, the sort and filter functionality. In the data group, we've refreshed our pivot table many times. We could change the data source, where we can select a table arranged within this workbook, or we can use an external data source connection. I'm going to cancel out of that and scroll back up. The next command group, the Actions command group, has a clear drop-down where we can clear the filters if there are any in place, or we can clear all, which actually clears your pivot table. If you do that in error, press Control-Z to bring it back. The next drop-down is the Select drop-down. We can select the entire pivot table, which we've done several times, to delete it. We also have the option to toggle the Enable Selection on and off. I'm going to left-click off of that and show you what that is. We have the ability to, if you hover just right, select the entire column. When you see the bold black arrow, we can go over here and do the same thing. We can also do the same thing by selecting the row. But with Enable Selection toggled off, you lose the ability to do that. I don't get that bold arrow displayed any longer. Finally, in the Actions group, we can move the pivot table to a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. Let me cancel out of that. And in the Calculations group, I'm going to select a value to activate the first two drop-downs, which we have covered in a prior movie, the Summarize Values By and the Show Values As options, which leaves us with the Fields, Items, and Sets options. And before we go there, I want to adjust my pivot table again. I'm going to pull the cost off and move the gross price into the values drop zone and remove the discount from the report filter drop zone. Going back to the Fields, Items, and Sets, we're going to create a calculated field. A calculated field is a field that's added to your pivot table in the values area that's derived from mathematical computations that are done on other fields that are in the field list on your pivot table. So we're going to add a calculated field. We get the Insert Calculated Field dialog box. This field's name is going to be Profit because I'm going to calculate the profit, and I tab to get to the Formula Insert field. And the profit is the gross price, Insert field, minus, and I'm just inserting a minus sign, the discount in terms of dollars, Insert field, minus the cost, Insert field. I'm going to add that to the list because you can have several calculated fields. And then I'm going to left click OK, and I'm going to have to resize the columns. And we have our calculated field. Selecting the pivot table once again, I'm going to move the sum of profit off of the pivot table. And I'm going to also move the product line off of the pivot table. And we're going to insert a calculated item. A calculated item is entirely different than a calculated field. A calculated field goes into the value area, and you cannot put a calculated field into the row headers or the column headers. A calculated item is the reverse. You cannot put a calculated item into the values area on a pivot table. So I'm going to left click Calculated Item, and we're going to figure a commission percentage for Jimmy, the salesperson. Tabbing to get into the next field, left clicking Jimmy, insert Jimmy, times the commission percent, which I'm going to make 10% of the gross sales, since that's what's displayed on the pivot table. I can add that, and going back to salesperson, we can add a commission percent for Mike, selecting Mike, insert Mike, times Mike gets 15%, and adding that, and going back up to the name field once again, we're going to get Rob a commission percent, tabbing into the formula field, clicking on salesperson twice, selecting Rob, insert Rob, and Rob gets 25% commission. We're going to add that. So now we have 3 calculated items, and when we left click OK, those calculated items are added to the pivot table. Jimmy gets 10%. We can see that that's correct. Mike gets 15%, and that's correct as well. And Rob gets 25%. And again, those values tie out. I'm going to delete the values in those cells. We're going to go back to the Options tab. The other choices in the Fields, Items, and Sets drop-down allows you to determine the solve order if you have multiple formulas at work, and you can also list your formulas. And Excel will insert another worksheet and list the formulas that we have. We have our calculated field formula, and we have our calculated item formula. Going back to the movie worksheet and moving on to the Tools group, we can create a pivot chart. I'm going to left click and create a pivot chart. This should look familiar if you've seen the movies on charts. And when we create a pivot chart, we get exactly the same options that we do with a regular chart on the Design tab, the Layout tab, and the Format tab. But in addition to that, we get the Analyze tab. We have the Active Field group, and when we select a series on the pivot chart, the selected series is displayed in the Active Field list. And when I select the category labels, I have the option to expand or collapse the fields so that when I have some nested groups in the pivot table, I can expand and collapse the pivot chart just like I can the pivot table. In the data area, we can insert a slicer, and we've seen slicers before. We can refresh the pivot table, and we can clear the filters if there are any, or clear the entire pivot table. And when I say clear the pivot table, that's because that's what we would do, because the chart and the pivot table are 2 independent objects, but they are linked so that changes in one will be reflected by a change in the other. So when I left click this drop down and do a filter, by left clicking just Jimmy, Mike, and Rob to be displayed in the chart is updated, and so is the pivot table. And because there's that pivot table functionality, we can hide or show the field list, and we can choose to display or hide certain buttons on the pivot chart. And once again, every time I make a change in the chart, it's reflected in the pivot table, and when I make a change on the pivot table, it's reflected in the chart. I'm going to select the pivot chart and delete it and go back to the Options tab and talk about the last group, which is the Show group. And we just saw a couple of these options when we looked at the Pivot Chart Analyze tab. We can display or not display the field list. We can display or not display the collapse buttons if we had some. And we can display or not display the field headers. So that was the Pivot Table Options tab. We began in the Pivot Table group where we could change the name of the pivot table, and we had access to the Pivot Table Options dialog box that gave us all kinds of options in determining how the pivot table functions and the way it's displayed. Then we looked at the Active Field group where we can change the name of the field, launch the Field Settings dialog box, and expand and collapse fields that have nested fields within them with the command buttons in the Active Field group. Then we looked at the Group command group where we can group and ungroup items displayed in the columns on the pivot table or in the rows on the pivot table. We skipped the Sort and Filter group because we've covered that in other movies. In the Data group, we have the ability to change the data source that's feeding the pivot table. The Actions group, we can clear filters or clear the entire table. We have some selection choices, and we can move the pivot table to a different place in the workbook or on its own worksheet. In the Calculations tab, we had already covered Summarize Values By and Show Values As. So we went on to the Fields, Items, and Sets drop-down command button where we created a calculated field and we created a calculated item. Then we went to the Tools group and created a pivot chart which is a chart that's linked to the pivot table, and changes in one will be reflected by changes in the other. And finally, we looked at the show group, where we can toggle on and off the field list, the collapse buttons, or the field headers.